Before we get started with the video, I wanted to let you all know that Grimdark Magazine's July issue is out, and I'm one of the featured authors this month. Grimdark Magazine is the 2016 Stabby Award-winning, 2018 BSFA-nominated, and 2021 Aurealis-winning publisher run by people who love the darker side of science fiction and fantasy. If you're a fan of dark science fiction and cyberpunk, then you're gonna want to check out this issue. So you should subscribe to them. Wink. Be sure to follow the link in the description and pinned comment to check out the issue. Last night, at the time of writing this script, after a night of axe throwing and drinking, I was a bit too buzzed to drive, so I decided to check out what was playing across the street at Movieland. No joke, that's what it's called. And after calling my wife to make sure I wasn't going to be seeing something she wanted to watch together, lest I wake the Kraken, I settled on a movie I knew there would be absolutely no chance of her wanting to see, an experimental slasher flick called In a Violent Nature. The premise is basically just Friday the 13th with a twist, and that is, for the most part, you follow the slasher villain, the demon, or ghost, or Jason clone throughout the movie instead of the college kids. Now, I don't really care for slashers. I get why people dig them, but it's just not really my type of horror flick. So already, I'm at a disadvantage when discussing this. But I do enjoy the original Halloween film, so I thought, why not? At the very least, it's an excuse to eat some movie theater popcorn. That shit is crack. However, I've seen a ton of experimental horror movies over the last few years. From the analog horror-inspired Skinamarink, the Nickelodeon-inspired I Saw the TV Glow, Talk to Me, The Lighthouse, Late Night with the Devil, and probably a bunch more I can't remember or don't want to in the case of She Came from the Woods. While many of these films end up doing some really interesting things, pushing the genre in ways that your typical horror narrative might not be able to do, I had a thought last night after finishing In a Violent Nature, as I left the theater with the 4 other people that were there, with mixed thoughts on the whole thing. And that's that many of these experimental horror films would do well to pay more attention to the storytelling being done in weird fiction. That's, a genre that included the likes of H.P. Lovecraft, Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard. And more recently, John Langan, John Horner Jacobs, China Mieville, Laird Barron, and Victor Lavallee, to name just a few. New Weird has this tendency to give you a literary punch in the face when you least expect it. It's a spiral into strange physics and madness, and much like the films being released by indie and mainstream studios alike, it's wildly and boldly experimental. Like this new wave of horror films, perhaps new breed is a better way to say it, it also isn't for everyone. But it's a genre that's been around for some time, and it's influenced quite a bit of our pop culture whether you realize it or not. From The Twilight Zone to Alien, the bold, rule-breaking storytelling of weird fiction is all over our speculative media. It's something that I find some of these experimental films sometimes fail to do in the end. And to illustrate why that is, I will first give you my thoughts on In a Violent Nature, Skinamarink, Vivarium, and I Saw the TV Glow. I want to talk about these films, warts and all. And I want to talk about how New Weird as a genre could help propel this new breed of experimental horror further, how it can hopefully inspire brand new nightmares in all of us. In a Violent Nature was directed and written by Chris Nash, and stars Rye Barrett, Andrea Pavlovic, and Cameron Love. Story and budget-wise, this is essentially just Friday the 13th if Friday the 13th was offered by Wish. And that's not entirely a bad thing. For what it's worth, Chris Nash manages to stretch the film's micro-budget pretty far. The story is incredibly basic. A bunch of camping, college-aged kids take a locket from a gravesite they have no business messing with, and all hell breaks loose. Well, a very slow-paced hell breaks loose. The film is shot in 4:3 aspect ratio, but appears to take place in modern times, so the choice is strange. In fact, most of it feels as though it's shot on a 90s camcorder. It is true that camcorders shot in 4:3, and it would have made a bit more sense for the film if In a Violent Nature took place in the 90s, even though it's not a found footage film. And frankly, the film is very 90s in general. From the way the characters dress, the dialogue, and the fact that one of the characters is wearing a Walkman. And the reason for that is he likes his Walkman, I guess. The opening sequence is intriguing, as we watch the film's monster and protagonist crawl out of the ground to begin his massacre. We follow this guy from behind as he tracks the people who visited his gravesite, leading to his first kill, and eventually to him finding a bunch of dumbass kids sitting around a campfire telling his origin story. Most people who are discussing this movie fall into one of three camps. Pun intended. Camp 1 thought this was a pointless film filled with boring-ass walking scenes and relatively tame kills. Some of these people wanted their money back, and I can honestly see why. Camp 2 thinks this film was incredibly unique and had a ton of potential, but they're not sure if they really liked it. They think the ending was a letdown. I'm in this camp, by the way. And Camp 3 just can't stop talking about the yoga kill scene. I won't show it on screen, but if you know, you know. These people will likely acknowledge the film's negative aspects, like an overabundance of walking, but want to see what the director might be able to do with a bigger budget. Now, in order to illustrate how I think this movie could have been done better, I'm going to need to spoil it a bit, a trend that will be repeated several times in this video. You've been warned. Fortunately, if you've ever seen Friday the 13th, then you know what happens. The movie does not change any of the rules of the genre you might be familiar with. And those rules are a mentally challenged child who dies and gets transformed into undead Dave Bautista, check. A bunch of semi-unlikable teens or college kids at a campground or isolated small town who can't help but disturb our sleeping monster Jason Stand-in, check. A rampaging monster driven by revenge who can't be killed by bullets, check. The killer wears a mask or is deformed, check, check. Characters who even think about having sex are not long for this world. Check and check. Gory kills that sometimes border on ridiculous. Check. Final girl. Check. Near the end of the film, I guess you could call it the third act, though I'm not entirely certain this film conforms to any sense of structure. The final girl's boyfriend tries to make a plan to put Not Jason back in the ground. He whispers that he's going to distract Not Jason so Final Girl can set the trap at his final resting place. But as you might imagine, things do not go as planned, and boyfriend gets an axe to the face. The irony of seeing this movie right after drinking beers and throwing axes at a target was not lost on me. So how would you expect a movie like this to end? Would you expect her to A, book it as fast as she can and carry out the plan that her boyfriend envisioned, summoning her resolve and facing down Not Jason in an epic clash? Or B, would you expect Final Girl to lay down her weapons and place the locket that was stolen from Not Jason for him to find and immediately run for her life, only to injure herself and pass out until morning? And be picked up by a random stranger who offers to take her to a hospital and tells her a story that might or might not have something to do with an incident involving Not Jason before the Final Girl realizes she is no longer in danger and that all Not Jason wanted was to get his locket back? If you chose B, you're correct, and your prize is disappointment, probably. Look, I get what the filmmaker was going for. The tension for the first few minutes of this random woman's story is great. You're not sure what's going to happen, but ultimately as this final sequence drones on, and as the camera pans over the bear trap and gas canister to reveal the missing locket, most people are inevitably going to feel cheated out of a proper climax. So you might be asking, what's missing from this? What could have been done differently to leave audiences with something they won't be forgetting as soon as the next big horror flick or Marvel movie comes out? Well, I thought there was at least a chance of something else, something a little more surprising, happening at the end of the film. And in my mind, it could have been something a bit closer to the original Wicker Man. If you haven't watched the original Wicker Man, you need to. It's such a weird movie and everyone needs to see it at least once, but do not watch the Nicolas Cage version.
Oh, no, not the beast! Not the beast!
What if, as soon as Final Girl passes out from blood loss, the random stranger of a woman drags her back to Not Jason's final resting place and is greeted by several other town officials. When Final Girl wakes up, she's wearing Not Jason's locket once more and chained to a pole. What if the sleepy little town does everything it can to keep its dark secrets, even if it means sacrificing an innocent group of kids to Not Jason? It's certainly something that would be a great punchline to a weird fiction story, and hell, some of my stories definitely have endings that are close to this. And yes, I was thinking about this scenario as the final segment of the film was going on. Sometimes my brain can't help but ADHD. If the goal was to create sympathy for Not Jason, then the film in its current state doesn't really do that. I guarantee an ending like what I just proposed would not only shock audience members, but also pay off the concept of following this unfortunate creature throughout the course of the film. The fear of finding yourself in a small rural town that hates you would also be a really relatable fear to explore with audiences. This is something that Lovecraft Country, the HBO show, does extremely well. How it puts you into Atticus's shoes as he is forced to live the dangers of a black man traveling alone in the 1950s is masterfully executed, and I feel it's something I'd like to see more of. At the very beginning of In a Violent Nature, we're treated to something of a flashback concerning Not Jason's backstory that sheds light on why he cares so much about this locket. It would have been really interesting if Not Jason inadvertently ended up reliving his own trauma, revealing the dirty secrets of this twisted little town to us through these flashbacks, which really would have juxtaposed really nicely with the version of the story told by the wildlife marshal, or whatever he is. I honestly forgot every character's name besides Johnny, or Not Jason. What if all these people who are supposed to be helping the college kids are lying? What if their goal is nefarious? This could have tied into how Not Jason was created. Maybe the whole town is involved in some weird cult, or maybe Not Jason's father, in an effort to cure Not Jason of his perceived flaws, performed a ritual that turned him into the monster we see in the film. As it stands now, there is no answer to why Johnny is the way he is. He just is. And I think that's a shame. The story that is presented to us isn't all that interesting, and it's stretched out between long plotting sequences of Not Jason just walking through the forest. If you enjoyed the film, let me know why. I genuinely want to know. But with that out of the way, I guess it's a good time to segue into the main meat of this video. I absolutely love the fact that studios like A24 are giving experimental horror and in some cases science fiction with the likes of Everything Everywhere All at Once, although I could totally see a narrative for it too being a horror flick as what's more terrifying than having to do your damn taxes. A fair shake in the current Marvel and superhero-dominated landscape of movie-going experiences. But I can definitely see that some of these projects haven't totally lived up to their potential, especially when it comes to films like I Saw the TV Glow and Skinamarink. Now, look, I love analog horror. Gemini Home Entertainment and Local 58 are my jam. I even dabble with analog horror myself when time permits on my OEI channel. I also love Skinamarink as a film. It's a deeply unsettling film and manages to do a lot within its limitations. The idea of being a kid trapped inside a house with no walls or windows is just... I had nightmares like that as a kid. The director and writer Kyle Edward Ball has his own YouTube channel called Bite-Sized Nightmares, where he makes short films based on nightmares his audience gives him in the comments section. And many of these videos are deeply unsettling. There's this one involving the figure of a man standing near someone's bed that absolutely freaked my wife out. And it might surprise you to find out that Kyle Edward Ball also released a short horror film on the channel called Heck that shares a very similar premise with Skinamarink. And that's because Heck was a proof of concept for Skinamarink. I'd urge anyone who didn't like Skinamarink or thought it had potential but was just too long to check out Heck. Because even as much as I love Skinamarink, I can't deny that some of the bad reviews surrounding the film have a point. You might even enjoy it a heck of a lot more. Once again, pun intended. Link in description. Hell, just do yourself a favor and subscribe to Bite-Sized Nightmares and give Kyle's videos a watch. It's well worth your time. But here's the main problem I think mainstream audiences have with Skinamarink as it is. It's meant to represent a nightmare captured on film and isn't a traditional narrative. Ball went out of his way to make you feel like you were in the shoes of these children. What he's doing with the film is channeling specific nightmares that a large majority of his fan base have shared with him, or at the very least, the parts that match up with each other. From his own admission, when he sat down with Pilot Productions for an interview, the most common nightmare shared in his comments section is children waking up to find their parents dead with a monster lurking somewhere in the house. The film is up to your interpretation. It's designed to evoke certain shared fears in us, which is why it's so ambiguous. This film is Kyle Edward Ball's greatest nightmare experiment, one that made its money back at the box office and then some. And that's with only being released in 692 theaters, compared to the thousands that most big budget films get released in. And I'll say this, I rewatched the movie for this video essay. My wife was away on a girls' trip, so I had the house to myself. I watched it after dark in my living room with the lights off. It was 12 a.m. by the time the film was over. I got ready for bed, and the whole time I was nervous to turn the lights out. I know there's nothing strange in my house, or at the very least, nothing that is going to harm me. But even as I turned the lights out, I didn't want to keep my eyes open in the dark. I didn't want to see what might be lurking in that darkness. That's how powerful the fear of the unknown is. It can override our logic, our view of reality. All it takes is the mere suggestion that something might be there. And it doesn't matter if you know nothing's there, because your brain will fill in the gaps. The human mind is funny like that. I've seen the movie at least 4 times at this point, and it's never failed to leave a lasting impression. And if you've seen it, you know there aren't many sequences that would qualify as traditional scares. But people who got the film will tell you that their minds filled in the gaps during many of those long sequences where the camera would stare down a dark hallway, creating figures and shapes from the noise on the screen. It is a profound, powerful thing that Kyle has made, and I can't wait to see what he does next. But there are people who just didn't get it. While it's possible that some of these people simply lack the ability or imagination it takes to put themselves in the shoes of these children, even with the POV shots and sequences in the film, the fact that so many didn't understand that this was what the film was going for or didn't care is a significant hurdle for reaching a larger audience with an experimental horror film. Mainstream audiences have a hard time accepting non-traditional methods of storytelling. I know, shocker, right? So I feel that if a filmmaker wants to go down the road of making an experimental horror film and they still want to capture a bit of that mainstream audience's attention as well, then their execution and storytelling has to be on point to deliver an experience that doesn't leave a large part of the audience in the dark. Get it? Because theaters are... yeah. The audience still needs characters and plot to latch onto in most cases. They need something that they can relate to. And I think, most importantly, their fears need to be exploited and explored. I think this is something that I Saw the TV Glow sets up pretty well in the beginning, but largely could have done a better job of leaning into. Set in 1996, I Saw the TV Glow was written and directed by Jane Schoenbrun, and it follows an awkward teenager named Owen as he tries to adjust to life in the suburbs. He makes friends with a girl named Maddie. Maddie introduces Owen to her favorite show, The Pink Opaque, a fictional TV show involving 2 psychic teenage girls trying to stop the creepy minions of Mr. Melancholy. Owen's life at home isn't perfect. I mean, ask yourself how well-adjusted you'd be if Fred Durst was your dad. And yes, this is the same Fred Durst from Limp Bizkit. And before I continue any further, I'm going to be spoiling most of the movie in order to make my point, so you've been warned. I'll have chapters available on this video just in case you need to skip ahead to the next section, or what have you. Owen isn't like other kids. He appears to have a lot of social anxiety. But after a school election night, he meets Maddie, a grungy loner reading an episode guide for The Pink Opaque. Owen's never seen the show before because it's on after his bedtime. Maddie is all too excited to talk about her favorite show and rebuffs Owen when he asks if it's for kids. She explains that even though the show is on the totally not Nickelodeon young adult network, it's way too mature and scary for kids. And this line, by the way, made me feel absolutely ancient. It's the last show on the block before they switch to black and white reruns for old people. Ouch! Eventually, Owen lies about spending the night at an old friend's house just so he can catch an episode with Maddie and her friend, who doesn't seem to react at all when Owen shows up. After the show is done and everyone's left, Owen is about to crawl into his sleeping bag. Maddie tells him to be out by dawn, that if her dad catches him, he'll break her nose again. She doesn't retreat upstairs, though. Instead, she sits there, talking to Owen for a while. She tells Owen that she's gonna get out of this town someday. Eventually, she lets the movie's entire premise slip. Sometimes the Pink Opaque feels more real than real life. At some point, as Owen is staring into the dark, he sees this faint static electric glow, something that's shown up a couple of times thus far. This static electricity bleeding into Owen's reality is supposed to tell us that something isn't right. And this is one of the things I have an issue with the film over, but I'll get to that later. After this sleepover, Owen becomes absolutely obsessed with the Pink Opaque, to the point where it consumes his life. But he's still not allowed to stay up late and watch the show himself, so Maddie leaves him VHS tapes in the school's AV room over the course of the next 2 years. Maddie and Owen barely talk during this time. At this point, it's 1998, and Owen and Maddie meet on the bleachers where this conversation happens. Maddie to Owen, I like girls. You know that, right? I'm not into boys. Owen, totally. That's fine. Maddie, okay, I'm just making sure. What about you? Do you like girls? Owen, I don't know. Maddie, boys? Owen, I think that I like TV shows. Owen states that he'd like to come over to watch the Pink Opaque live, and they have another sleepover. After the show is done and Owen's crawling into his sleeping bag once more, Maddie reveals that she's going to run away from home. Owen responds by saying he'll have no one else to watch the Pink Opaque with if she leaves. And eventually she asks if Owen will run away with her, that they'll know where they're going once they get there. And one day, Maddie just disappears, leaving behind a burning TV set. Police have no idea where she went, and Owen doesn't see her again until he's a grown man working at an eerie movie theater. Right after this, the Pink Opaque gets cancelled and Owen is forced to go out into the real world and get a job. He ends up working at that eerie movie theater working for a bunch of assholes. Actually, it's at this point the viewer might realize that everyone other than Maddie in Owen's life is a major prick, and even his mother, who is kind to him, gets cancer and dies halfway through Owen's time in high school. Owen's dad, Frank, is practically an apparition. He almost never talks, especially once Owen becomes an adult. In many sequences, Frank just stares in the dark, the TV illuminating his face like a phantom. This is where the film finally starts to take on some dreamlike qualities, where it attempts to pay off its premise, where some of the environments take on the uncanny look of liminal spaces. And spoiler alert, we're going to be talking a lot about liminal spaces in this section and in the next one. The empty grocery store Owen shops at is a good example of this. The lights are dimmed to such a degree, you would think the store was closed. But just as you start to put together that something isn't quite right about the store, Maddie shows up again, with a whole new look that mirrors Tara from the Pink Opaque. Owen is understandably shocked to see her, and asks if anyone else knows she's alive. She tells Owen that she'll explain it, but not in the grocery store. Maddie drags Owen to a dive bar and music venue on the edge of town and makes a bold claim. She tells Owen that the Pink Opaque is real, and that Owen and Maddie are the main characters in the show, but they've been trapped in Mr. Melancholy's Midnight Realm. You see, at the end of Season 5, Tara and Isabel had their hearts removed by Mr. Melancholy and were force-fed moon juice before they were buried alive so that they would live out their last moments in a false reality. This sequence is actually pretty decent in terms of overall creepy vibes, and feel like they're clearly inspired by analog horror. The shot of Tara and Maddie's hearts beating inside the industrial freezer is effective. But the Moon Man himself, I don't know. I wasn't expecting CGI in this shot, since the film has gone out of its way to use practical effects before this. In typical villain fashion, Mr. Melancholy gives the plot away. Mr. Melancholy. Soon, you won't remember anything. Your real name, your superpowers. You won't even remember that you're dying. Maddie explains that she went to Arizona to escape the feeling she had while living in the suburbs. But despite living under a new name and having tons of new faces around her, that feeling never went away. So of course, one night when she couldn't take it anymore, she paid a burnout kid $50 to bury her alive. That's pretty fucking dark. And she tells Owen that when she died in that grave, she reawoke as Tara in the Pink Opaque. But things don't go according to plan when Maddie attempts to get Owen to bury himself alive so he can wake up in the Pink Opaque and get to Season 6. While Owen isn't quite sure what to make of all this, and justifiably thinks Maddie's a bit nuts in the head, the viewer is given blatant clues that Maddie is right throughout the rest of the film's runtime, and we're left feeling sorry for Owen as he rejects the offer to get out of this nightmare realm, despite how often he is shown that he will eventually die if he does not cross over. This conversation triggers memories in Owen, albeit briefly. He remembers discovering the truth about the Midnight Realm and trying to crawl through the front of his TV only to be stopped by Frank. This leads to a scene where Owen screams, "You're not my dad," as Frank holds his head over a bathtub, and Owen vomits blue sparking liquid. He also remembers that in the final episode of the Pink Opaque, he saw himself watching TV in the snow globe offered to Isabel by the Moon Man. Ultimately, Owen rejects Maddie's offer, knocking her over in the football field and beelining it the fuck out of there. Something I haven't really mentioned up till this point is the fact that Owen has been narrating his story to us, which is another problem I have with the film. I don't like these segments. And he eventually explains that he never saw Maddie again, that his dad died not long after the incident with Maddie and he inherited the house, got himself a big screen TV and a family we never see. The final scenes play out in the Fun Center, something we see first advertised on an eerily lit billboard. The fun center is full of references to Mr. Melancholy and all the monsters we've seen in the footage presented to us from the show. In one nightmarish scene, a child stands in a money-blowing machine with the words, "You are dying," illuminated in digital red letters. Owen is old now, although the age makeup is not great here, and I'm seriously wondering if this was done on purpose. He carries an inhaler and seems to have a lot of trouble breathing. And in one of the final scenes, Owen loses his shit in the middle of singing Happy Birthday to a room full of kids. And in the middle of that freakout, the entire room stops, as if time itself is frozen. But Owen doesn't seem to notice, apologizing for his rudeness. In the very next scene, Owen's manager checks on him while he lies on the bathroom floor. Owen says he's fine, but then immediately proceeds to cut his chest open with a box cutter. And my mother-in-law could not help but comment on this scene, stating that the sound the box cutter makes is nothing like what it would actually be. She was a nurse, so I guess she would know. Next thing we see is Owen standing before the mirror, revealing the light contained within his body. The final scene of the movie is Owen stumbling through the fun center, apologizing to uninterested people. He's clearly not accepting the bizarre nature of what is happening around him. While some might argue it's possible that Owen is an unreliable narrator, I don't think this was Jane Schoenbrun's intention. I think we're supposed to take the liminal nightmare of Owen's reality at face value. That the pink opaque is the reality Owen and Maddie come from. But I don't think the film as it is does this well, and while it is certainly a horror film, many people I talked to after my first viewing of the film were confused why it was marketed as one. They felt the movie they were sold in the trailer was totally different from the one that they got. I Saw the TV Glow is certainly an interesting experiment in filmmaking. By Jane Schoenbrun's admission, it is a film about gender dysphoria and the private hell that people who suffer from it but don't transition endure. There are allusions to childhood trauma and abuse in the film as well, but those are also wrapped up in the trans allegory as well. I'm close friends with a few trans people, and since one of the characters in an upcoming book of mine is a trans artist, I wanted to do as much research as I possibly could to make that character as authentic as possible. So I understood what Jane Schoenbrun was going for. The metaphor is pretty clear, even if the film itself is somewhat confusing on a first watch. But not everyone understood that message. I first saw the film with my mother-in-law and wife, and neither of them put those pieces together. And while I acknowledge that I Saw the TV Glow is not without its merit as an experiment, I also see why audiences haven't totally resonated with the film. It's true that it's not directed at general audiences, but rather a very small niche that will understand what Schoenbrun was going for, and the fears that she was trying to evoke in her intended audience. I was in elementary school in 1996, but I remember the shows this film was inspired by, and in the case of Are You Afraid of the Dark, I watched it. The allusions to them are charming and at times terrifying in a way, even if the film as a whole doesn't totally work for me. And really, that's fine. We absolutely need films that appeal to smaller audiences as much as we need ones that appeal to wider audiences. But for my own sensibilities and for the purposes of this video essay, I want to ask myself how the film could have gotten its message across and still appealed to a wider audience. Is something like this just going to be a lost cause with general moviegoers? Or could there have been a path to presenting the story in such a way that it exploits the fears general moviegoers have, to get them to empathize with the character's plight, to understand why they'd want to escape the liminal nightmare of the Midnight Realm? Now, I'm not a director, but I am a published author who is quite familiar with the genre of weird fiction. I've read stories not too dissimilar from I Saw the TV Glow in magazines like Black Static, Grimdark, Weird Tales, and so many anthologies. And by the way, if you aren't reading John Langan, you should be. His short stories are on point. So, I'm going to put on my editor hat and ask the questions that I think my own developmental editor, Phoenix, would ask if she were editing a story. First off, I think the first change that I'd make is have the film lean more into atmospheric horror. I'd also bring in the threat and eeriness of liminal spaces the film offered us in the third act at the end of the first act. I mean, if we're being unambiguous about this being a nightmare realm ruled by a moon demon, then let's lean the fuck into it. I'd accomplish this by making the details in Owen's suburban neighborhood, home, and school seem off. Not just the messages that are on the walls, but the position of the lights, light switches, crown molding, windows, and any other seemingly normal detail that would gradually become more and more askew, more odd as the second act marches on. Do any of you remember that episode of Batman the Animated Series where Bruce is stuck in a dream reality where he's not Batman and his parents are alive? Strange proportions and wrong details. That's what liminal spaces and dream logic are all about. Skinamarink does this incredibly well, and it would have been something truly incredible to see the threat and horror of suburban life reflected through the lens and language of shared nightmares. It feels to me like Jane Schoenbrun's intention was to make it absolutely unambiguous that the reality Owen and Maddie are living in isn't real. That they're really these two girls from their favorite, totally not Nickelodeon show, The Pink Opaque, which itself is a reference to shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark, The Secret Life of Allison Mack, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But instead, the final sequence of the film, while full of anxiety, feels like a half measure. And to illustrate why that is, I want to talk about something else. A little internet short film turned viral sensation called The Backrooms. The Backrooms is a short film turned full-on YouTube analog horror series created by Kane Pixels and based on what has gone from a creepypasta made on 4chan to something more or less resembling an urban legend. The short film and creepypasta revolves around slipping through the cracks of reality, only to end up in this decrepit, moldering hallway that looks like it could belong to a defunct office building. But as you explore, you notice that turning down a corner does not yield a path to an exit. There are no windows, there is no furniture, no doors, no people. Just an endless series of increasingly wrong corridors, moldering wallpaper, garish, flickering yellow-green light, and the threat that something might be watching you. Some versions of the Backrooms rely on simulation theory to aid in its existential horror and the suspension of disbelief. And it's the theory that our reality, our planet, our civilization, and the rest of the universe is all an advanced computer simulation. That life is literally a game. And thinking about that idea is enough to drive some people into an existential dread-fueled panic attack. Who doesn't love that? But there's another type of horror at play in the Backrooms, and that is the fear of liminal spaces, or liminalophobia. You might ask, what is a liminal space? Is it just an empty office? A big space? Anthropologist Arnold van Gennep said that liminality refers to the quality of the second stage of a ritual, especially a rite of passage that involves some change to the participants, especially their social status. The liminal state is characterized by ambiguity, openness, and indeterminacy. One's sense of identity dissolves to some extent, bringing about disorientation. Liminality is a period of transition during which the normal limits to thought, self-understanding, and behavior are relaxed, opening the way to something new. In terms of physicality, a liminal space is one of limbo. It's a space between where you were and where you're going. And if I'm reading this definition right, it's where your anxiety about where you might be going festers. But that's not all that makes liminal spaces scary. I'm sure at least some of you have heard of the Uncanny Valley before. For those who aren't familiar, the Uncanny Valley refers to how close an object is to resembling a human being. There's this narrow gap in features where our brains will perceive a painting, character model, or statue as inherently wrong. And this is going to be represented on screen as a graph. If you've ever known someone who's afraid of dolls, this is why. Something in our brains tells us that the doll isn't human no matter how lifelike the details are. This is also why some CGI effects look inherently off-putting to us, especially CGI from the 90s and early 2000s. But the Uncanny Valley isn't just about what we perceive as human or what is imitating the aesthetics of the human. It can also extend to places, and specifically liminal spaces. What makes a liminal space creepy can boil down to how out of place certain things are, how weird the proportions and perspective are, how wrong the lighting is, or the fact that it appears to go on and on and on, like an endless hallway created by holding two mirrors close to each other, known as the Drosty effect. If you've ever pondered at an M.C. Escher painting, this is pretty close to what I'm talking about. And there's a film other than Skinamarink, and other than the short film The Backrooms, that admittedly does this pretty well. And that's the 2020 weird horror flick Vivarium, or Vivarium. I don't know which one's correct. Vivarium was directed by Lorcan Finnegan and written by Garrett Shanley and Lorcan Finnegan, and follows Tom, played by Jesse Eisenberg, and Gemma, played by Imogen Poots, a gardener and school teacher respectively, who are ready to take their relationship to the next level and commit to buying a home. They visit a weird little store where they meet an oddly dressed realty agent who awkwardly brute forces them into taking a tour of one of their homes. But when Tom and Gemma get to Yonder, a suburban housing development where every house literally looks like a carbon copy of the last, the odd realty agent abandons them in the backyard and is nowhere to be found. And after driving around this suburban nightmare, they find they always end up back at house number 9. That no matter what they do, how far they walk or run, every street is exactly the same. That there is no wind. That the clouds are perfect, cloud-shaped clouds. Also, they're out of gas and are forced to spend the night in the house. They notice that a box of supplies has shown up in the middle of the street, seemingly from nowhere, and that the food has no taste. Eventually, another box shows up, containing what looks like a human baby boy. Yes, you heard that right. It's suitably weird. The instructions on the box read, "Raise the child and be released." In the very next scene, Tom and Gemma wake up to see this weird little child standing before their bed. They flip him off, as one does, and attempt to go about their day trying to find some means of escape despite the fact that they've been stuck in this place for over 3 months. The child's behavior is quite odd, and he grates on Tom and Gemma's nerves as much as he does the audience's. Similar to the kid in the Babadook, the difference being, of course, that the kid is the monster here. I don't want to rehash the whole film, since this video essay is already over 6,000 words long, and you're probably expecting me to get to the fucking point sometime this century. But it's eventually revealed that Tom and Gemma aren't raising a human boy. He's something else, and whether he's an alien organism or a dimension-hopping mole person, we're never given the answer. Tom and Gemma are ultimately doomed to die in this liminal suburban nightmare, and the child they raised eventually takes the real estate agent's place from the beginning of the film. It's a parasitic life cycle of sorts, which is also blatantly shown in the opening title sequence of the film, so there's no denying what the film is really about. The title itself is also a clue. A vivarium usually refers to a research facility where animals are observed. It's a room or tank that offers what researchers assume the animal needs to survive, attempting to mimic their natural environment as closely as possible. And just in case it's not already blatantly obvious, in the film, we are the animal. And the suburban liminal space is what whatever the hell is researching Tom and Gemma thinks our environment is. Really, Vivarium would be an excellent film if it weren't for one flaw. It forced me to stare at Jesse Eisenberg's face for almost 2 hours. The liminal spaces and the metaphors relating to the dead end and stagnant nature of suburban life are pretty great, even if you can't quite understand what Gemma sees in Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, Jesse Eisenberg. I mean, he's a robot, right? Right? No, but seriously, even if you dislike Jesse Eisenberg, like me, it probably says something that I'm still recommending the film. Many reviews have suggested it's a bit like an extended Twilight Zone episode, and that's a pretty apt description. While my initial viewing of the film left me wanting more, or maybe the same film without Jesse Eisenberg, my second viewing was much better, and the pieces of the film that didn't work for me before seemed to gel a lot better. And frankly, now that we've mentioned it, Twilight Zone is essentially Weird Fiction the show. Name a classic Twilight Zone episode and there's a good chance it has a banger of an ending. Just ask yourself if any of these experimental horror flicks have an ending that matches the impact of Time Enough at Last. You know the one, don't you? Where a bank teller survives the end of the world and has the misfortune of breaking his glasses once he finally sits down to read some of the books on his TBR stack. Because there was time enough at last. If you're a voracious reader and you just don't have time to read, this is a whole mood. I saw that TV Glow could have gone harder with its liminal spaces, and could have leaned more and more into Twilight Zone territory. If the Pink Opaque is the true reality, why not offer glimpses and nightmare-esque encounters with the creatures in the show? Good weird fiction will lead the reader, listener, or viewer through a gradual descent. It will offer a reality at first familiar to us, and gradually, as the story progresses, it will offend both the POV characters and our definition of reality. It will present us with an ocean that is the wrong shade of blue, a sky full of cloud-shaped clouds, a black primordial sea, and a drifting landmass towering into the clouds, whose surface details we can't help but interpret as scales. I'd say if you like these experimental horror flicks, if you like Twilight Zone and films like Alien and The Thing, then you owe it to yourself to check out more weird fiction. The genre has so much to offer. Take The Fisherman, a book by John Langan, for example. It's a tale about a man named Abe who's just lost his wife to cancer and finds comfort in fishing with a friend, Dan, who lost his entire family in a car accident. The two don't speak much, they just fish. Until one fateful weekend, Dan suggests they should go up to this spot Abe's never heard of called Dutchman's Creek. A terrible storm strands them at a diner, and the cook tells them a fever dream of a story about an ancient godlike force, a primordial leviathan, and a man who bent that force to his will and wreaked havoc on a small settlement. The Fisherman is a new weird and cosmic horror novel about grief, and it is a book that feels like it's being gradually narrated to you by a crazed Willem Dafoe in the middle of a raging storm. But this is not John Langan's first foray into this kind of horror. Most of his short fiction fits into this category as well, especially the stories found within his anthology, The Wide Carnivorous Sky and Other Monstrous Geographies. Inside this anthology is a host of weird tales that take all kinds of different approaches in telling their narratives. Sometimes these stories hint at cosmic horrors beyond our understanding, sometimes they are closer to home, but they are always suitably weird. The first two stories deal with zombies. I'm not a big fan of zombies, and often their presence in a story is enough to get me to skip it entirely. But the second one, titled How the Day Runs Down, caught my interest from the start because it's not a traditional narrative at all. It's told from the perspective of a stage manager relating the events of the zombie apocalypse. It's told like a nightmarish play, jumping around to various viewpoints to illustrate what makes this take on the concept different. It's not a tale of survival. No, it's a slow countdown to curtain call for humanity. It's certainly worth a read. But I think my favorite story in the collection deals with a bizarre headless fertility statue. It's called Mother of Stone and largely feels like a reinvention of Shub-Niggurath, whose name will not be shown here because it's spelled and sometimes pronounced in a way that is super racist, because H.P. Lovecraft was a shitty person. The Lovecraftian entity that is often associated with fertility and corruption. Now, despite my issue with Shubby's name, I find her to have a ton of potential, and plan to do my own takes on her in the future, though I'll probably just refer to her as the Mother, or the Black Goat, or something else. The story revolves around a young journalist who's working on a story revolving around a series of accidents and how they all seem to be tied to this strange ancient statue of a fertility goddess. She's told not to look too deeply into where this buried statue came from, and suffice it to say, it is an awesome spiral into cosmic horror that I can't recommend enough. Frankly, this story alone deserves a film adaptation. Oh, and did I mention this story is told in second person? Yeah, John Langan is one of the few authors who can fucking pull that shit off. John Langan also isn't the only John working in weird horror. It sounded way better in the script. John Horner Jacobs is the author of A Lush and Seething Hell and Southern Gods, and also a couple anthologies I still need to read. A Lush and Seething Hell is actually two stories. The first one, The Sea Dreams It Is the Sky, is the stronger of the two. It's a cosmic horror story that explores what it would be like to live in a South American dictatorship, and a girl who gets involved with a man who reflects on how he was forced to translate a Lovecraftian grimoire. While in my opinion the second story of My Heart Struck Sorrow isn't quite as good, it's still well worth a read. Southern Gods though? Man, this book would not let me go. It's more of a traditional narrative than an experimental one, but the way it uses Hastur is quite interesting. It takes what made A Lush and Seething Hell great and dials the weirdness up to 11. And I absolutely cannot reach the conclusion of this video without recommending The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavallee, a cosmic horror novella that involves jazz, black magic, and all the general weirdness one might expect from a tale of cosmic horror. It also gives us the most realistic reason why someone would want to join a Lovecraftian cult, so, you know, there's that. Here's the blurb. Charles Thomas Tester hustles to put food on the table, keep the roof over his father's head, from Harlem to Flushing Meadows to Red Hook. He knows what magic a suite can cast. the invisibility a guitar case can provide, and the curse written on his skin that attracts the eye of wealthy white folks and their cops. But when he delivers an occult tome to a reclusive sorceress in the heart of Queens, Tom opens a door to a deeper realm of magic and earns the attention of things best left sleeping. A storm that might swallow the world is building in Brooklyn. Will Black Tom live to see it break? Seriously, read this book! While many of my personal favorite weird fiction tales would qualify as epistolary stories, where the story is told through journal entries, a few of them, like Ballad of Black Tom, are straight-up traditional narratives. And some of them, many of my books and stories included, mix the two formats, similar to how experimental horror flicks are beginning to mix their traditional narratives with analog horror-inspired elements. New weird authors like myself are hard at work experimenting with finding horror in photographs, journals, projectors, urban legends, phishing, computer viruses, AI, video games, and yes, even TV shows. Sometimes this works really well, and other times those experiments don't always pay off. The fact is, weird fiction and cosmic horror have been exploring these ideas a lot longer than film has. Literally, the genre has existed since 1895, maybe even earlier. And I believe it's important to study the classics. It's why I refused to write a King in Yellow story until I had done my research on Robert W. Chambers and read his King in Yellow stories. I'm not sure if filmmakers like Kyle Edward Ball or Jane Schoenbrunn pay attention to weird fiction as a genre, but if they do intend to continue making these kinds of films, then familiarizing themselves with the way this genre bends storytelling rules and experiments with format is going to be a must. I think many of the experimental flicks that have come out in recent years would have been that much stronger if they had studied weird fiction. I mean, it's done my creative drive wonders. In conclusion, while the recent string of experimental horror films offered by A24 and other indie and mainstream studios is a breath of fresh air, this blooming brood of horror is in its infancy. Many of these experimental films end in a way that is unsatisfying for general audiences, even when they don't end in an anticlimax. I think in order for this new generation of horror films to thrive, it's going to need to look at what's worked in the weird fiction genre. And it'll have plenty of works to draw inspiration from, as the genre is over 100 years old now. I do not think weird fiction is too weird for general audiences. If that was the case, then shows like The Twilight Zone and movies like Alien would not have become classics. No, what endeared those things to audiences was quality writing, direction, artistic fervor, and vision. I honestly believe that if the right crew gets behind the right script, then it's fully possible for general audiences to get it. It's possible for you to share your nightmares. So what are you waiting for? Go write. And also, haha, segue, go buy my fucking books. I'm Eric Malikyte, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.